Hello, and welcome to my critique presentation, which is Issues in Teaching Western Classical Music Through a Social Justice Educational Lens. The overview or the framework of this critique will assess why do we teach Western classical music, who is being represented in studying Western classical music. From this, we will discover what the benefits of Western classical music pedagogy in the school system are, as well as its limitations, how we can improve Western classical music pedagogy, and at the same time, how we can improve music pedagogy in the education system in general. So I chose to critique teaching Western classical music in the school system because as we know, it dominates education not only in terms of repertoire, but in terms of the types of instruments that we study, the types of notation that we learn, how we learn rhythm, how we learn music, so on and so forth, in a music education classroom. So, according to Wayne D. Bowman, music teachers start with an understanding of music suited to one particular engagement and practice, craft a definition of musicianship derived from its primary instruments, privilege curricula and pedagogies that nurture that kind of musicianship, select students for advanced study, hire faculty to serve the needs of those students, assess success in terms of the extent to which the norms and values of that tradition and its conventions are preserved. So, from these 6 bullet points, we understand that music education revolves around one particular practice, and from that practice, we create or we develop musicianship from its primary instruments. Pedagogy revolves around that practice. The students are then selected for that practice. So students who excel in that practice are selected, and faculty is even hired based off of that practice, and assessment is based off of that practice. So, Western classical music determines our musicianship, our practice, our pedagogy, our high achieving students, our faculty, and our instruments, our notation, so on and so forth. So we can see how the practice of teaching classical music in the education system isn't necessarily that teaching Western classical music is integrated into the classroom. It's that the classroom is revolved around Western classical music. It is created to teach Western classical music. So, because of this knowledge, I went ahead and tried to figure out from my readings why we teach Western classical music. Why is it so emphasized and why is it so important in our society? According to the Ontario Arts Curriculum, it privileges Western standard notation. I actually went ahead and tried to see how the Ontario Arts Curriculum privileged Western standard notation, and I noticed that a lot of the specific expectations use the word standard. And I feel like you can write an entire PhD thesis paper on what is quote unquote standard music. And if you read between the lines through even the example that I put here, C1.5 demonstrate an understanding of standard and other types of musical notation through performance and composition. What do you really define as standard and what do you really define as other? And is standard more valued or more privileged than other? Why is other other? So on and so forth. An interesting quote that I found from the Hess reading in 2016 was from Locke in 1993, which is that he refers to classical music as cultural spinach, which is this notion that classical music is good for you. And then the notion continues with empirical research studies, popular empirical research studies like the Mozart effect or classical music makes you smarter. So there's again this notion of superiority in Western classical music over other studies, like world music or even jazz music. So who is really studying Western classical music? According to Kenneth Elpis and Carlos R. Abril, the demographic of high school students in large ensembles, choir, orchestra, and band, 51% are in suburban schools, 27.6% are in urban schools, and 21.3% are in rural schools. So there's clearly a giant gap from suburban schools to urban schools. We can see how nearly half of the demographic in suburban schools are in large ensembles, choirs, orchestras, and or band, whereas only 27.6% and 21.3% in urban and rural schools are a part of this. So, according to DiLorenzo, urban schools reflect high levels of poverty and high concentrations of Black and Latino students. So we're seeing a socioeconomic divide as well as a cultural divide between suburban schools and urban schools. From this, we can see that urban schools have an inability to afford and maintain orchestral instruments. They also have struggles with cultural identity for minority students. So just talking about these 2 bullet points on its own. You can argue that Western classical music privileges the more financially stable societies or environments, communities is the word I'm looking for, because of the financial stability it requires to buy, keep, and maintain these orchestral instruments. And then, there is this idea that historically classical music was something that was privileged to the elite societies, and you can argue that based on its financial need now, that it's still something that can really, even though it's available to the public, is really more available to the higher class. There's also struggles with cultural identity for minority students. So classical music coming from Europe and rich Europe was dominated by white male composers, and from that came a white male compositional sound. So why, if the idea is we teach who we are and we learn who we are we teaching who we are when we're teaching something that was written by someone who is the exact opposite of us, someone who, if I'm a female minority that came from a lower socioeconomic class, am I really going to connect to a composition that was written in a time period from someone who came from the exact opposite of that? So moving on, it's breeding for a stigmatized occupation with a low and unstable income. And I brought this up. It privileges white-dominated spectrum of music and musicians. There's a lack of voices studied, culture, race, religion, and gender. Arguably, it's designed for advanced, privileged students connected to the music and style and financially able to pursue the music professionally. just to be devil's advocate, I also wanted to add the benefits, and the two main benefits are that it prepares students for a professional pursuit of music outside of school. Um, but even with that, why is the professional music world something that needs a classical music education to really excel in the field? Arguably, do you even need a Western classical music education to excel in the field with the rise of pop music and jazz music as well? And then again, I brought up the Mozart effect, which there is some research that does suggest that classical music arouses spatial temporal abilities and enhances mood. So, what are the solutions from this critique? What are some solutions that we can implement in music pedagogy? And it comes from Hess in her 2018 reading, which is Critical Pedagogy. Critical pedagogy encompasses feminism, critical race and class work, disability, and queer theory. It decenters teacher and fosters polyphony of voices and politically engaged music education. There's less focus on Western repertoire and more focus on pop and world music. It is this idea of teaching to transgress. It implements problem posing education, creating a dialogical, critical education in which students and teachers can work collaboratively, and teaching Western music through a critical lens. So, this last point is essentially that we don't have to get rid of classical music in general, but we can teach it in a way that involves all voices, all identities. For example, you can draw comparisons between a Mandarin song called Mo Li Hua and Puccini's Turandot, and you can draw these comparisons in terms of notation, melismas, meaning, difficulty, so on and so forth. So these are some discussion questions that I came up with. How important is with teaching Western classical music pedagogy in Ontario schools? Why do you think the Ontario arts curriculum privileges Western classical music pedagogy? Do you think critical pedagogy is a feasible solution for social justice education in teaching classical music? Why or why not? And how do you feel about classical music pedagogy as an educator? Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and we will see you soon.